You're washing dishes, hands full of soap suds. That's when a gecko, the kind that's lived on kitchen walls across the tropics for as long as anyone remembers, darts across your foot. The whole thing takes less than a second. But in that instant, your hand jerks, your heart rate spikes, your body reacts like it just found a real threat. Here's the strange part. That animal is almost completely harmless. It doesn't bite. It has no venom. It even eats the mosquitoes in your house. So why does your brain still sound the alarm? This isn't a hypothetical. It happened to me. What bothered me wasn't the gecko. It was what happened right after. I knew it was harmless. I had every piece of information I needed. And still, the flinch showed up before a single thought had time to form. It felt like two systems running at once. One analyzing the situation, the other just reacting. And in that race, the reaction always wins. Which means maybe we've been asking the wrong question from the start. Not, why do you still get scared of something you know is harmless? But, what is your brain reacting to before knowledge even has a chance to weigh in? To find out, look at two very different cases. An ant, almost harmless. Most of the time, it's just quietly hunting for crumbs. A centipede. It can actually bite, and the bite can hurt, swell for hours. If disgust were simply a measure of danger, your reaction to these two should look very different. Usually it doesn't. In that first split second, both can trigger almost the same recoil. Which raises an interesting possibility. Maybe the brain isn't grading these creatures by how dangerous they are. So what is it grading them by? The answer starts with something psychology separated a long time ago. Fear and disgust aren't two intensities of the same emotion. They're two entirely different alarm systems. Picture your brain wired with two separate bells. The first is built to catch direct threats. Its job is simple: keep you from being attacked. The second is tracking a different kind of danger altogether. Not fangs, not venom, signs of pathogens, contamination, infection risk. Its goal isn't to help you survive an attack. It's to keep you from getting sick. Here's the interesting part. With snakes, and to some extent other reptiles, both bells can go off at once. An elongated body, smooth skin, a way of moving low along the ground. These traits can trip multiple alarm systems simultaneously. Not every species does this the same way. Some mostly ring the fear bell. Some lean harder into disgust. And some manage to ring both at nearly the same moment. If that's true, that split second with the gecko starts to make more sense. What showed up in that instant was probably never a single emotion. It was two separate signals arriving at consciousness at once, fusing into the one shiver we've always called by a single name. But that raises a bigger question. If this bell matters so much, why doesn't knowledge shut it off? To answer that, we have to go back millions of years. In 2006, anthropologist Lynne Isbell proposed something called the snake detection theory. The idea is fairly simple. For most of primate evolutionary history, venomous snakes were one of the deadliest threats around. So individuals who spotted a snake faster, even by a fraction of a second, had better odds of surviving to pass that trait on. If the theory holds, its fingerprints should still be visible in the brain today. And that's exactly what scientists set out to test. In 2008, developmental psychologists Vanessa LoBue and Judy DeLoache ran a simple experiment. They had children ages 3 to 5 and adults search for a photo of a snake hidden among pictures of flowers, frogs, and caterpillars. In both groups, the snake was spotted noticeably faster. But here's the more interesting question. Was that just something people had learned? To test it, LoBue later ran the same kind of study on infants 8 to 14 months old, too young to have learned to fear snakes from experience. The result held. These infants still oriented toward the snake image faster than the controls. In other words, at least part of this alarm seems to be wired in before life has a chance to teach it. The snake detection theory picked up another striking piece of evidence. Isbell pointed out that lemurs in Madagascar, a place with almost no venomous snakes throughout most of their evolutionary history, have far less specialized vision than primates that evolved alongside venomous snakes elsewhere. That's exactly what the theory would predict. Without the pressure to spot snakes fast, there's less evolutionary reason to build a visual system finely tuned to catch them. None of this is the final word, of course. Isbell herself admits the theory still lacks direct neurological evidence, and scientists still debate whether this mechanism is specific to snakes or extends to any creature with a similar shape and way of moving. But whatever the final answer turns out to be, all of it points to the same possibility. The brain may start sounding the alarm before consciousness has confirmed what it's even looking at. The first bell explains the gecko fairly well. Then along comes a completely different case, the cockroach. It isn't long and slender. It doesn't move like a snake. So why does just seeing one trigger nearly the same recoil in so many people? That's where the second bell comes in. In evolutionary psychology, it's called the behavioral immune system, a concept developed by psychologist Schaller. If your biological immune system kicks in after a pathogen has already gotten inside your body, the behavioral immune system tries to stop that from happening in the first place. Instead of killing bacteria, it scans for cues that might be linked to illness, garbage, spoiled food, waste, or creatures that tend to show up in places like that. Seen this way, the cockroach is close to a textbook case. The disgust doesn't appear because it's necessarily carrying disease. It appears because, across evolutionary time, steering clear of those cues was usually the safer bet. At first, everything seems to line up neatly. One bell explains the gecko. One bell explains the cockroach. Then the gecko undoes its own explanation. It doesn't live in garbage. It has no clear link to contamination. If anything, it's helping keep the insect population down. If the behavioral immune system explains the cockroach so well, it barely explains why so many people feel the same thing looking at a gecko. That's the moment it becomes clear the mistake was in the name itself. Maybe disgust was never one emotion. Maybe it's the shared experience produced when different alarm systems all send signals up to consciousness at once. Systems reacting to different threats, shaped for different reasons, that happen to arrive at the same feeling, a shiver we call by one name. Which leads to the real question. If both bells have already gone off, can knowledge still change anything? The answer lies in the brain's order of operations. What happens first isn't understanding, it's detection. The moment a familiar shape crosses your field of vision, the alarm rings. Heart rate climbs, muscles tighten, your hand jerks back. Only afterward does consciousness catch up and piece it together. Asterisk, that's just a gecko. It's not venomous. Asterisk. In other words, knowledge doesn't arrive late because it's wrong. It arrives late because arriving first was never its job. Think of a smoke alarm. The moment it detects something close enough to smoke, it goes off immediately. It doesn't wait to confirm whether it's an actual fire or just steam rising off a pot. And it certainly can't be talked down with an explanation. Your brain runs on a similar logic. The systems built for vigilance are optimized to react first. The systems built for analysis are optimized to understand second. That's not a failure of reason. It's not a sign of weakness. It's the result of two mechanisms, evolved for two completely different jobs. One to keep you alive, the other to help you understand why you just reacted the way you did. If all of that holds, then for years we've probably been lumping a lot of different experiences under one word, disgust. Ants, cockroaches, centipedes, geckos. On the surface, they all produce something that feels almost identical. But underneath, it's likely two different bells taking turns, or sometimes ringing together. If that's true, there's no single switch to turn it all off. Quieting one bell doesn't mean the other quiets down with it. Learning more about bacteria, or simply getting used to a cleaner environment, might weaken the reaction to contamination cues. But that won't necessarily silence the bell that responds to shapes tied to evolutionary threat. So can these bells learn anything at all? It looks like they can. One of the most studied approaches is exposure therapy, which grew out of psychologist Joseph Wolpe's work on systematic desensitization. The idea is fairly simple. Instead of trying to convince the brain there's nothing to be afraid of, you give it the chance to learn that for itself. In a safe, controlled setting, repeated exposure to whatever triggers the fear or disgust can gradually turn down the intensity of the response over time. Not after one exposure, not just from learning one more fact, but after many, many repetitions of the brain receiving the same message. This time, nothing happened either. But that raises another question. What actually changed? Was the bell itself turned down, or is it still ringing exactly as loud as before, while the systems downstream simply learn not to react so strongly? Science doesn't have one clean answer that covers every case. If a gecko darts across your foot again tomorrow, you might still flinch. Your heart might still race, at least for that first instant. That probably won't change after one video. But something else will have changed. That moment won't be a mystery anymore, because behind it isn't weakness. It isn't a lack of reason. It's the trace of a system that existed long before humans had any way to explain it. That bell was never trying to persuade you of anything. It doesn't argue. It doesn't analyze. It does exactly one thing: detect the signal and get the body moving fast enough to survive. The gecko in that kitchen was still just a gecko. It didn't become any less harmless. It didn't become any more dangerous. What changed wasn't the animal. It was the way you look at your own reaction. Because sometimes, understanding a fear doesn't make it disappear right away, but it can change the story you tell about it.